Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day of the Data Summit. This is track A, and in track A, we are discussing the move to a modern data architecture. And in our first session this morning, we have James Serra with us, who is a data platform architect at EY and previously was a big data and data warehousing solution architect at Microsoft. He's going to be talking to us this morning about Azure Synapse Analytics overview, data lakehouse. And with that, I'll turn it over to James.
All right, thanks so much. Let me pop open my screen here and let's see. Is that coming in okay now?
Yes.
All right.
Great.
So welcome everyone. My name is James Serra. I am a data platform architect lead at EY. This session is Azure Synapse Analytics, data lakehouse. I recently joined EY. Before that, I was at Microsoft for 7 years. I spent a lot of time talking with customers on the modern data warehouse, and a big part of that is Azure Synapse Analytics. So I wanted to spend this short time we have going over Azure Synapse Analytics at a high level and then jumping into a demo so you can see it in action. I've been involved in the database world for quite a long time. I won't go back to my COBOL days, but I have been using SQL Server since the 80s, and along the way have become very familiar with, in talking with customers about the modern data warehouse, about technologies that have expanded with big data growing so much now into this multiple parallel processing or MPP world. And Synapse has become a big part of that. And so after this introduction, part of it, I wanted to bring out Azure Synapse Analytics has GA'd. It started, it's been, well, December now, so a handful of months since the product, which was in public preview for quite a long time, has gone official. So I'm glad to see that happen. Now, when we look at the world of data, there has been a data warehouse of relational data that's been around for decades. And then maybe 10 or plus so years ago, the concept of the data lake came out. And the idea with the data lake is to take data, usually big data meaning it could not only be large, but it could size of data, but could also be non-relational data, so semi-structured data. And it was put into a data lake, and through Hadoop technologies, people looked at it and were able to explore this data, but usually had these two separate identities, with the data lake for that semi-structured data and then the relational database on there, which had the benefits of speed and security and held a lot of the relational type data, but they were always separate. And so what Synapse Analytics tries to do is combine these two into the idea of a data warehouse and a data lake into this concept you may have heard recently called a data lakehouse. And the idea is joining both of these worlds to make, and allowing the end users to investigate the query to report on this data, whether it's sitting in a data warehouse, a relational one, or in a data lake, and not have these two separate identities as it's been in the past. So if we look at this at a high level, if you're familiar with Azure, we have a number of, Microsoft has a number of products that work when you're looking at building a modern data warehouse. Things like Azure Data Factory and Databricks, and then previously SQL Data Warehouse was just a relational database, and then Power BI and data lake storage. And it was a little complex because you'd have to jump to all these different tools, and there was no sort of single pane of glass for all. But that's where Synapse Analytics comes into play, is that single pane of glass that can allow you to use all these technologies and not have to jump out of a new tab or a new workspace on there. So it makes it much easier if you're trying to do a modern data warehouse to not have to leave that single pane of glass. And when some confusion was that Microsoft had this product called SQL Data Warehouse that was around for a long time. And it being a relational database that had a number of features that it kept adding to it. You can see these on the left. So there's features that are recently GA'd and public and private preview. And this is just the relational database part of that. Well, what happened was Microsoft came out with Synapse Analytics that added a bunch of new capabilities you see here on the right-hand side. Now, that SQL Data Warehouse piece is still around, but it's called the dedicated SQL pool. So it's a big important part of Synapse, but it's just one of many features that they have now. And the way I like to look at this is via this diagram is within Synapse Studio, you have this idea of workspaces. Usually that's broken out by project level, or maybe dev, test, and prod. But inside this workspace, you're going to have this new product called Azure Synapse Studio. That's going to be the glue, that single pane of glass that all your features are going to work under. One of those features is the ingest piece. And within Synapse, you'll see in a demo that they have Azure Data Factory pipelines and mapping data flows. Now, it's not called Azure Data Factory within it, but it's the same code base. So you'll see the pipelines and the mapping data flows that you can use to ingest the data. That data is going to land in storage. And if it's a traditional relational database, you still have your relational database, which is attached to a dedicated SQL pool, formerly called SQL Data Warehouse. This is where you have your one-on-one combination of a dedicated pool, the compute power, with a relational data warehouse. So whenever you create this dedicated pool, just like before, you get a relational database with it. New is the SQL serverless component here. And this is a real game changer because this allows you to do queries against data that could have landed into a data lake. And the great thing is I can use regular T-SQL over this data. And you'll see this in the demo, how much easier Microsoft has made it to query data that is in Parquet or JSON or CSV file, and use regular T-SQL, which we're all familiar with, and only pay per query. So this is what the serverless SQL pool gives you. Also, you see we have this Apache Spark pool option on here. So this is new, and this allows you to use Apache open source and create notebooks and query data, whether it's sitting in a relational database or data lake or a Spark table, which you can create. There's also the option in here is if you create a Spark table with your Apache Spark notebook, that you can query that data using the SQL serverless pool. So that's why we have an arrow there that points to the Spark tables from the serverless SQL pool. So I can create this Spark table with an Apache Spark cluster, and I can shut it down, but still access the Spark table through the SQL serverless pool. And this is because it shares the metadata between the Apache Spark tables and the serverless SQL pool. There's also a feature that allows you to query a Cosmos DB. And that is through a feature called Synapse Link. And that allows you to use regular T-SQL to query data sitting in Cosmos DB, as opposed to using the Cosmos DB flavor of T-SQL. So you see underlying here is the ability to use T-SQL against all these data sources. To the point is I can create a query that will go against these data sources and use regular T-SQL and can actually join data sitting in a data lake and Spark table in Cosmos DB. So if I want to get to this federated query approach or a logical data warehouse where I didn't want to always pull in the data into a central source, like a relational database, I can query like this and leave the data as it is and use regular T-SQL and only pay per query. So now, thinking through this, that means if I'm using Power BI as my visualization tool, I can create a view on top of a file sitting in a data lake and expose that view through Power BI. And Power BI can then run that query and only pay when that query is run and do it against a data lake. So it appears to the end user that they are querying a relational database when in fact it's just a view over the data lake or a Spark table or Cosmos DB. So there's a lot of options when you get into the ability to land data and query it, and we'll show some of that in the demo. So if we look at and by the way, I'll take questions at the end of this, so that we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions in there. And of course, I shared my email, and I will at the end where you can follow up with questions after the session if we don't get to them. So if we look at the modern data warehouse now, you'll see there's a lot of options along all these stages. And I usually break it out into the ingest, explore, the transform, the model, and then the visualize. And now we can have multiple options on there. So we can use whatever tool we're most comfortable with, or it will give us the most speed, or it will give us the best performance. And so if we look at transform, I can now use regular T-SQL with a dedicated Synapse pool to transform the data. I can use a Synapse pipeline. So this is like a data factory pipeline to transform the data with mapping data flows. I can use Spark Notebook if I want, as well as I can use Synapse Serverless. So instead of paying for a cluster that's running with a dedicated, I can have a serverless option now to transform the data using regular T-SQL. So a lot of options here, a lot of flexibility. And hopefully along the way, I'll explain some of these in more detail so you can see which particular feature will work best for you. So the Serverless SQL pool opens up a whole nother world of querying data in there. And I talked about how it syncs to table definitions. And it's important to point out that while I said you can use Synapse Studio to query, to have that single pane of glass, you're not limited to that. So if I wanted to use other tools like SSMS or Data Studio to query that data, or to modify some of the table definitions, for example, I can still use those products because it exposes an endpoint into your dedicated pool or to your serverless pool, so you can use it outside of Synapse Studio. So serverless gives you a lot of benefits, and this is similar to the way serverless works in SQLDB, if you're familiar with that. So now we have it within Synapse Studio that can use serverless against data sitting in a data lake or in a Spark table or in Cosmos DB. So what I like to think of is there's three areas now you can use for serverless, three scenarios. One is just basic data exploration. You'll see that in the first part of the demo. I have a bunch of files sitting in a data lake. Well, what's inside of them? I can query that very easily. I can also have that logical data warehouse. So where I mentioned I can have data sitting in data lake, Spark tables, Cosmos DB, and I can query it without having it ingested also to have that logical data warehouse. And then third is data transformation. So if you're a company and you really like to use T-SQL, you've built a lot of stored procedures to transform the data, you can continue using that with the benefit of now you're only paying when those queries run. So this kind of summarizes three different ways of thinking of scenarios for serverless. All right, cool. So let's go into a demo. And this is a demo that you can build on your own on this link, and this deck is already shared out there. It has instructions on there to set up this environment that I'm going to show you, as well as a step-by-step lab that you can go through in much more detail than what I'm going to cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so to get all your hands-on experience on this. So there's a number of demos that are underneath this Azure Analytics and AI engagement on here. And I'm going to focus on the retail one. Now, when we look at querying the data, I created this table to show you there's a lot of different options on here. So if we look at the top table on here, I talked about the four different storage: relational database, data lake, Gen 2, Spark table, and Cosmos DB. And then there's different pools that you can use the compute portion of this to query that data: a dedicated SQL pool, the old SQL Data Warehouse, the serverless pool, and then the Apache Spark pool. And you'll see not every situation is supported yet. That's why I put it on here. Some are coming in the next version of Synapse Studio, but this will give you an idea of what's possible now. And then on the bottom table here, I created this because you can right-click a lot of objects, whether those objects are a Parquet file or CSV JSON, or they're a relational table, as you see here, or a Spark table. And you'll have certain options available to you that I'll cover in the demo. But almost everything is supported now, except for a handful where there's a preview option that's not yet. So this is a good way to understand what's possible now in Synapse Studio. And the SQL pool, just to clarify, it supports 3 current file types. Those are Parquet, CSV, and JSON. Now, if you have something outside of that, you can use Spark to query it. But if you want to use regular T-SQL, you're limited to those 3. All right, so let's jump to the demo. So if we look at how we get started with Synapse is if I log into my Azure portal and I type in Synapse, you'll get this Azure Synapse Analytics. And I've already created a couple here. This is your workspace. So there's not much you need to do to get one of these created. You'll see on here, I come in here and choose description, resource group, the region, workspace name that you want to have on here, and then it's going to ask you for data lake store. Think of this as sort of a temporary, where it puts temporary data on there. So you want to create an account in the file system name for that. But outside of that, that's basically all you need. And after a few minutes, about 4 or 5 minutes, you'll get a workspace here. And if I click on the one I've already created, you'll see I have this dedicated SQL pool. So as remember I mentioned before, you can use these pools or the serverless outside of the Synapse Studio that we're going to jump to. So these are what you would use in say SSMS to connect to it. The first thing you'll want to create, which you can do right before you jump into Synapse Studio, is the pools. So we have two options here. We have the SQL pool. So that's the former SQL Data Warehouse. And then we have the Apache Spark pools. Now, if we look at the SQL pools, you'll see there's already a built-in one. That's there by default. There's one. It's always running. And then you can see I've created a dedicated pool. So if I look out at how that works, if you're familiar with SQL Data Warehouse, this will look familiar to you here, is where I put in the pool name. So this is my relational database that's going to be tied to this SQL pool. And then the performance level, that's that scale that gives you the performance. And it's pretty linear. So if I'm running queries and I'm using, say, DW1000, if I go to 2000, those queries should just about double. And so that's it. You create a pool. It takes a few minutes, and then you have your relational database on here. Anything you create here can be paused or scaled on that. So there's no auto pause or auto scale yet. That's coming. But this is a great way to save cost, where you can come in here and pause it, say, or run there's various options that you can pause these things instead of having to manually do it. So some customers would go out and say, oh, after certain hours, I'm going to automatically pause it, or scale it up or down after certain hours. Now, the other part of this is Apache Spark pools. So you can see I created 4 of these. Now, these are very similar to if you went through Databricks before, the way you set that up. You come in here, you specify the node size. So we have Microsoft's 5 options in there, the number of nodes, and whether you can auto scale. So if you have a query that needs more horsepower, or a number of queries come in there, the ability to auto scale up and down is there. And then if we look at the additional settings, we have the ability to pause on here after a number of minutes. So this is a great way to save money. And then you can set up a number of different sizes, so you can give permissions to certain people depending on the importance of the queries of which particular Spark pool they can use. All right, so once you get all that stuff set up, if you go into Overview, you'll see I have this Synapse Studio. So this is where it jumps into that single pane of glass. And under the Synapse Studio, here is where you'll do all your work. And one of the first things you'll want to do is, let's expand this to show you, is you want to go to Manage. And here is in Manage, those SQL and Apache Spark pools I created are here. And then there's link services in here. So I can go in here, and this is where I can link other things that I may want to use within my workspace. I can link a Power BI. I can link a bunch of different storage on here. I can link a Cosmos DB, and then there's more to come. But this allows you to consume any of these particular resources within your Synapse workspace. There's even an option to link Purview on here. For those familiar with that data catalog, you can use that to search within Synapse Studio. And then I can also link in a certain code libraries, which is a new feature on there. So a lot of possibilities on here, and you'll see this as we go through the demo where I'm using those. So one of the first things you'll want to do is, if I go back to the home, is I want to ingest data. So, okay, great. I created the workspace. I have a bunch of sources out there. I want to ingest them into maybe a data lake as well as a relational database. But I can click this ingest. So this is, for those of you familiar with Azure Data Factory, this will look familiar on here. Here's where I come in here and I say, I want to ingest data and I want to create a new connection or use something I already created before. And maybe I have data sitting out somewhere in say, Greenplum or MySQL, and I want to ingest that. So I will come in here, I will enter connection information for the source. I will then enter connection information for the destination where I want to copy that to. And I then specify whether I want to run this once or on a schedule, and it will create a pipeline for me that will ingest that data. So if I then go into integrate here and I look at pipelines, for example, say I created where I want to ingest SAP data, HANA data in here, it'll create this copy data command. And you'll see that we have all these settings that I went through that prior wizard to set up. And it's going to copy that data from SAP into this destination sync, which is part of the data lake. And I can also add functionality to say, okay, once I copied in there, I then want to use a data flow to transform that data. And this is where we get into the mapping data flow. So here's all the functionality to go in there and transform that data, and then say land it back into the data lake or into the dedicated pool of Synapse on there. Okay, so that gets the data, and say we landed into a data lake in here. Now we have options to start querying that data. And this is where we get into a couple I'll show you. So in the deck on here, you'll see I have slides where I'm showing what I'm going to demo. And this is a serverless pool using Parquet. So if I go back to the demo here and I click on data, I had previously linked in my data lake on here. So you can see once I expand on this, I have the folders that I created in my data lake. And one of these folders is custom Parquet. And here's where I uploaded a bunch of files, or I used Data Factory to land those files inside of here. So here's where I would say the magic happens is I have these Parquet files. I want to see what's inside of them. I want to explore. Well, previously to do this, it was a bit of a pain. I'd have to use something like Databricks. I'd have to go and create a cluster. I'd have to start the cluster. I'd have to link to this data lake, and then I'd have to run a query using Spark SQL as one, and then I'd be able to see what's inside of it. And that could be time consuming and costly. Now what I can do is if I right click this, you'll see I have an option, new SQL script, and select top 100. If I click on this, and I run it, you'll see it's using this built-in connection here. And within 2 seconds, it queried the file. And the magic is this open row set where I specify where that file is I want to query. And I can even come in here and say, well, I don't want to use just one file. I want to query everything that's inside of that folder, that's Parquet. And I can run that, and it's going to return the results of the dozen or so files that I have sitting out in there. Now, this is regular SQL. So on here, I can also use a where clause. And I can say where, say, gender equals male. And then I can run this and get the results back from all those files sitting in Parquet. So compare this to the way it was before. It's such a huge improvement in value and getting time to value in there, seeing what's in there. So I can explore these files. I can even use some other options in here, like the preview that I mentioned briefly before. Is if it's a CSV file, I can right click and just hit preview, and then I automatically get what's inside of that file. So think of this as a real quick and easy way to explore data. But now I can go to the next level. I can create a SQL statement that's pulling out data on, say, that Parquet files, and I can make this into a view and save it in the serverless pool. So the serverless pool doesn't have any data on there, but I can create views on it, and then I can query those views from, say, Power BI. If I go to my workspace and I open up the database, you'll see I have my SQL serverless, that's the built-in, and on here I can create views. And you can see I even have a view for Cosmo So if I run this view that is simply a query into a Cosmos DB, is now, it appears to the end user, they think they're querying maybe a relational database on there. They have no idea this is actually going out to Cosmos DB. And so just a few seconds, I'm now querying Cosmos DB with regular T-SQL. Okay, so there's lots of options for this. So I just touched on a few of them. Now, if I want to look at something that's in the Spark world, if I go back to my Parquet and I right-click this, you'll see I have a new notebook and I have a load to data frame. So what this is going to do is give me a shortcut into using a Spark notebook. So you'll see here, I choose a pool and then the language I want to run it in there. And you can see it's already chosen Spark to use, but it now created what used to be time-consuming process of linking that Parquet file into this notebook. And then once I do that, and in this case, it's just going to display what's in there, I can then build on this and I can create additional cells on here to build out my notebook on here. And then I can save this notebook. And as an example, if I go into develop, you'll see I have notebooks here. And I also have SQL scripts that I've saved. And then I have those data flows that I showed you before are all under this develop tab. And I could save all this into Git, DevOps Git or GitHub. And that's where we have this option here where I can set up a code repository and have branches out in there. So everything I'm doing within this workspace can be saved into a branch and then merged later on there. So we're integrating data ops, Microsoft's integrated data ops into Synapse. Now you also see this Power BI option on here. So what this allows me to do is I can use Power BI within the product also. And you can see I have here's the data sets that I've previously created. And then there's Power BI reports. Of course, it's going to fail. So let me go back and show you how that works. If I go back to the link services, you'll see I have Power BI on here. So let me just remove this and I'll add it back in here. So to link in a Power BI workspace, it's as simple as coming through here. It's going to look at and find my tenant. It's going to say, let me try this one. And it's going to pop out what workspace do I want to use, and I create it. And that's all that's to it. So now when I go back to my develop on here, you'll see on here that I now have a Power BI works dashboard on here. So I can go in here and I can create reports through here, and I can create data sets through here, and I can update or create a new report through this interface, or I can go right in the Power BI desktop and create the Power BI report. So this is a one-stop shop. So as a developer, I can go in here and say, not only do I want to ingest my data and then clean it, but now I want to run a report to see if the data that I've ingested and cleaned looks accurate. And that's where I can do this through this workspace. Notice I've never had to jump out onto a different tab or create a different workspace on here like you used to do. It's all underneath this one umbrella. And I still have my traditional, if I go back to my workspace here, databases on here. So if I wanted to use good old-fashioned T-SQL against a relational database, I can come up here and I can just right-click this and I can do the new SQL script and voila, I'm now going and doing something that maybe usually you want to do through SSM instead, but you can do it right through here. And because this dedicated pool is very powerful, I can run really large queries on here that can go anywhere from 20 to 100 times faster than regular SQL Server or SQL database. So if I look at one here now, this is not a large one. So there is the option, if you want to do this on your own, to create a table that has billions of rows on here. And in this case, I just created one with 3 million. If I run this, so it's a pretty complicated query here. It's got a sub-select on here and it's running of 4 or 5 tables on here. And just in 5 seconds, it returned that query. And if I run this with the billions of rows, which was an impressive demo that I gave when I worked for Microsoft, but I have some challenges creating this on my own, but because of costs in here. But you'll see this would take honestly about 10 or 11 seconds to do the query on the first run, and then after that, it would take about 4 or 5 seconds after it cached some data on here. Now I could expand this too if I wanted to join data sitting in a data lake, or in a Synapse or a Spark table, or in Cosmos DB. I can add that to all this if I wanted to have that federated query approach to it. All right, and one other thing before I start taking questions, if I go onto the monitor here, and this allows me to track everything that's done. So if I'm running Spark or SQL, and I want to go and dig into the query and the query plans, I can do a lot of this through this monitor portal. Now I can also do this outside with third-party tools because of the ability to have those endpoints where you can, I showed you on the overview tab to log into, that you can log into, so you can still monitor this outside of that. But Microsoft has created a great way to do most of what you would need to do while staying within inside the Synapse Studio. All right, so I got about 8 or 9 minutes for any questions that you may have. So let's open it up the floor.
All right. Great. Thanks so much, James. That was really a very interesting presentation. We do have one question related to the comparison of cost compared to more traditional methods, and particularly what people may be doing now in Azure, moving to this method. Do you have any insights on how that may affect cost to the end organization? Using this new functionality, will that potentially decrease costs, or is it cost neutral?
Yeah, the idea with Synapse Studio is to save costs on there. So a lot of times I get the question, well, when would you look at Synapse Studio if compared to something like SQL database? And where is that threshold? And it's hard to say because a lot depends not just on the size of the data, but the type of queries you're running. But if you get over, say, 4 terabytes of data where SQL database most of the versions can't support more than 4 terabytes, you want to look to using things in Synapse. So most times with customers, if they're creating a data warehouse, they almost always want to go to just look at Synapse from the beginning, because even if I don't have a lot of data now, eventually I'm going to have a lot of data.
Yeah.
So I don't have to kind of reinvent things and switch to this. So the MPP technology gives you that great performance. Now, the great thing is you can save costs by using the serverless. And so I can land data now inside a data lake and never even have to copy it to a relational database. So this could get into a much bigger discussion, and which I blogged about on, do I need a relational database? And in most cases, you still want a relational database because that'll give you extra performance, higher concurrency, more security, and then the fact that the metadata is sitting along with the data. So it's a lot easier for end users to query that data if it's in a relational format than trying to do it in a data lake where the metadata is separated out from those files in there. But because you have the serverless options, I can land data in there and I can query it. And if I've got some decent skills as an end user, and I understand how all this works, I can do a lot at that point. Or I can even have somebody from IT create views on top of that data sitting in the data lake, and then I can use Power BI. So I'm never having to move it to a relational database. Once you move to a relational database, you have the extra cost of the storage in there, and then the compute can be more expensive than the serverless option in there. However, if you just say I'm going to go all serverless and you're not careful and you're running a lot of queries, that can actually cost you more than a dedicated tool. So this is where I always recommend the customers do a POC with your actual data to see what the costs are for each of these different options. And then you can see which way to go. But I would say in the long run, using Synapse and understanding all the options can save you a ton of money compared to doing it other ways.
Great. So we do have a couple of additional questions that have come in. The first here is Synapse and Data Factory available on private cloud through Azure ARC? mainly since we have data gravity for IoT at the edge. Is Azure Cloud the only option?
Yes, the currently only option is to do this in Azure Cloud. Now, not being at Microsoft, I don't know what the latest is, but there was the idea of allowing you to use Synapse on-prem along with right now you can do that with SQL database and such. And down the road, it will be where you can have it on your own cloud. But for now, it's you have to go to the Azure portal.
Okay. So that does tie into our next question, which was, can Synapse query on-prem data stores?
Well, so that's a different thing. So while Synapse can run in the cloud, it can query on-prem. So let me clarify this. I can use the pipeline inside of here to pull in data that is sitting on-prem into Synapse Studio, whether that lands in a data lake or in a relational data lake database on there. Now, I cannot have, if I go back to my diagram here, where I can, what happened to my slides, where I can query, sorry about that, data that's on-prem using one of those features that I listed right here. So there's only these four that I can query. Now, in the future, it will have many more options on here. I can query, say, Oracle or SQL Server on-prem. But for right now, you can pull on-prem database data, but it's got to be pulled into storage in there, at least in the short term.
Okay. All right. Well, it looks like at this point, we're at the end of our questions. If anyone else has an additional question, please feel free to type it in. And James, do you have time to meet with the folks in the session in the networking area?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump over to that. And if you have other questions after that, you can go and shoot me an email on here. I have a lot of deeper dive on what I talked about on my blog, as well as other videos that talk about the modern data warehouse and go into some more demos on Synapse Studio. But happy to have conversations on there. Because there's so many more features in this, it can get confusing on the proper use case. So a lot of times I had to explain to customers all the features and then understand their use case, do a bit of discovery to know which feature within side of Synapse would be best to fit your situation. And it's not a one-all be-all. So a lot of customers would say, well, I'm going to use Data Factory pipelines, but I also may want to use Spark for some ingestion. And then when it comes to querying data or transforming data, there's usually a mixture, heavily dependent on the skill set of the customer. If they say, well, we love Spark, then sure, go with data with the open Spark notebooks for a lot of things for transformations or querying. But if you don't know anything about Spark, you may want to look at starting out with Data Factory, the mapping data flows. They even have another thing coming out in preview of wrangling data flows, which is essentially Power Query. So you can use that to query your data or transform your data, I should say. You can also then jump to using T-SQL to query your data. And then you can get down the line to go into open source of Apache Spark to do it, or even the Databricks to transform your data. So I always say you move down this line, you get more features and functionality, but at a trade-off that it's more difficult to build something like that, and especially if you don't have the skill set on there. But many customers use a combination of 2 or 3 of those options.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great presentation. We're at the end of our time, so I invite everybody to go over to the networking area. And so if you look over to the side of the screen, you should see networking, and then there'll be a pop-out for groups. And if you go to the networking area for track A, we can continue the conversation until the next session, which will be at the top of the hour. So again, thank you very much, James.
Sure. Thanks. My pleasure.